And good morning from Mission Control Houston, and welcome to today's International Space Station update. You're joining us here inside of the flight control room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, looking down as the Orbit 2 team is monitoring all of these systems on board the orbiting laboratory. Today's team is being led by Flight Director Scott Stover. You can see just standing up there. Joining him at the Capcom position, serving as our communication link between all of our controllers down here on the ground and the astronauts up in space, will be Kathy Bolt. And those astronauts up in space, the crew of Expedition 34, possibly in their last day as a crew on board the International Space Station. They were being led up until yesterday by NASA astronaut Commander Kevin Ford, who handed over command of the station to Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield yesterday. Kevin Ford in the front row on the left there. Behind him, Oleg Novitsky and Evgeny Turelkin of the Russian Space Agency. Those three scheduled to return a little bit later this evening. Moving across the back row, we have Russian cosmonaut Roman Romanenko and NASA astronaut Tom Marshburn, who will remain on board, with Chris Hadfield also in the front row there on the right as the crew of Expedition 35. As mentioned, the big item on the list for today's activities will be that return of three of our expedition crew members, NASA astronaut Kevin Ford and Russian cosmonauts Oleg Novitsky and Evgeny Turelkin, currently scheduled to depart from the International Space Station and land in Kazakhstan tonight. The entire crew sleep shifted over, waking up at about 8 a.m. Central Time a few hours later in order to shift over for all of these undocking operations. However, right now the landing is currently under review by Roscosmos officials due to some adverse weather conditions across the Kazakh steppe. Some fog and freezing rain prevented some of the search and recovery helicopters from deploying a little bit earlier this morning out of their staging city of Kustanai, Kazakhstan, over to Arkalyk. You can see a number of the recovery vehicles here. The current weather forecast, though, calls for some of the improving conditions to move across the Kazakh steppe over the next 24 hours, but still not clear if those conditions will improve enough to enable a landing on time tonight. State Commission members are expected to meet a little bit later this afternoon Central Time in order to evaluate whether or not to go ahead and push ahead with tonight's landing events or delay it about 24 hours to March 16th. But as of right now, everything's still on schedule. Hatch closure for that Soyuz TMA-06M spacecraft scheduled to take place at 4:15 p.m. Central Time. That'll be our first live broadcast as we bring you all of tonight's events here on NASA TV. We'll also have undocking coverage beginning at 7:15 with that undock command being given just a few minutes before the physical separation at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. Then our final coverage will be for the eventual landing, picking up at 9:45 with the deorbit burn, sending the Soyuz craft through the upper atmosphere at 10:04 p.m. Central Time for that on-time landing of 10:57 p.m. Central. Meanwhile, on board the station, much of the crew working to get ready for this departure. NASA astronaut Kevin Ford retrieving a few samples from the minus 80-degree laboratory freezer for return on the Soyuz craft this afternoon. He'll also be helping out Tom Marshburn with an ultrasound. He'll be accomplishing fairly soon, and also just getting everything ready for his departure. Meanwhile, his Soyuz crew members, Oleg Novitsky and Evgeny Turelkin, are hard at work getting the last few items packed up and installed in their Soyuz craft and running through all of the spacecraft checkouts and departure preparations in advance of their leaving. You can see the current station structure here. Their craft, the TMA-06M spacecraft at the top there. On the space-facing side of the station, currently docked to the Mini Research Module 2, or the POISC module. It's been docked there since October 25th when these three astronauts first arrived. And then this will be what the station looks like once that craft departs. The Soyuz 07M, which carried our three Expedition 35 astronauts, will remain on board. Will stay docked, as well as three unmanned cargo craft, including that Dragon resupply vehicle, which docked just a few weeks ago. And staying on board, Chris Hadfield, who's our new commander of the International Space Station and will command Expedition 35 after taking over from Kevin Ford yesterday afternoon. He'll be helping out with some of that departure prep and also working on the station's environmental health system, doing some air quality monitoring and some routine maintenance on the station's ARED device, known as the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, one of the numerous exercise pieces of equipment on board the station for these astronauts to maintain health. Meanwhile, Roman Romanenko will be fairly busy inside of the Russian segment, as he'll be the point person for all of the undock operations from the station perspective, completing all of the communication checkouts between the Soyuz and the station, also removing some of the clamps on the side of the Poisk module and photographing the area. Also be responsible for activating the telemetry system inside of the Russian segment, which is used to receive data sent out from that Soyuz spacecraft during its return to Earth and recorded on the station telemetry system. And our final expedition crew member, Tom Marshburn, as mentioned, is doing an ultrasound this morning, doing it on his spine, and he'll be assisted by Kevin Ford. He's also firing up the capillary flow experiment for a second day in a row now, which you can see here is a fluid physics experiment that looks at the capillary forces, or how fluids move up surfaces in that microgravity environment.